Story 1. Not technically the first day, but the second day. When I was 20 or so, I got hired to be a temporary floor member for Forever 21 during the holiday season. My training started a week before Black Friday, so the store was already in chaos. On my first day of training, I walked in, and the floor manager gave all the new hires a tour showing us the facility and layout of the store. After this, I was assigned to a veteran floor member to shadow and get an idea of what my job was and what my duties would be. As soon as I was assigned, the manager left, never to be seen again. An hour and a half into my shift, my mentor got an emergency family call and had to take off for a week. When this happened, I found another floor manager, explained the situation, and asked them who else I should shadow. The manager's response was, "Just do what you can by yourself. You'll be fine. Everyone else is busy." Figured, well, okay, I'll try. I don't know if any of you have shopped in the women's section of Forever 21, but during seasonal sales, they will have multiple articles of clothing that all look almost exactly the same, but with slight differences. Like a white cardigan with 4 buttons that looked exactly the same as a white cardigan with 5 buttons. The best part was these different items were often placed in completely separate parts of the store, and it was the job of the dressing room to return the unpurchased items to the correct section so the employees could put them back on the shelves. Well, these employees were terrible, and I didn't know if the items were a part of my section or not. So I'd spend a ridiculous amount of time trying to find where they go before realizing, wait, this isn't even my section. I've checked every rack. So I'd put it back on the sorting rack and move to the next item. More than 50% of the stuff I was told to reshelve wasn't my section. I just did as best as I could and got ready for my next miserable day. The next day I came in, and the store manager pulled me to her office and told me how slow I was the day before, and if I wanted to keep working there, I needed to be very fast. I explained my lack of training and unfamiliarity with the store, and she told me if I didn't know where the clothes were in sections, I should come in my free time and memorize where stuff was. I spent the rest of my shift putting clothes in random places, then never came back for a third shift. Forget that place and their management. Story 2. I used to work at a craft store as a cashier but quit when I moved. I ended up going back a couple of years later to make some extra cash, but this time in the framing department. During the interview, they assured me I would only ever be a backup cashier because I said I refused to have full cashier shifts. The first shift after the interview is listed as framing, but I'm put on cash and told that actually most of my shifts would be cash since they had found someone else for framing. I spent the next 6 hours giving everyone who came to my register 20% off everything and then never went back. Story 3. My first internship was at a Brazilian teen detention center. It is similar to a prison, but Brazilian law has some distinctions between crimes committed as an adult or as a teenager. Teens go through socio-educational measures. I was walking through a courtyard with my supervisor when some doctors came running, flailing their arms and screaming, while officers came running from the opposite direction. I was pulled by my supervisor, who just told me to run back to our office. These teens, as young as 12, had escaped their block. A few minutes later, an officer came knocking on the doors of the offices, yelling for everyone to run outside because a fire had broken out. Some of the teens had set mattresses on fire in their cells. I didn't really opt out. My teacher did. She hadn't even been there that day, so I was forced by the university to choose another place to intern at. Oh well. Story 4. I was 17 and working with precast concrete. I refused to use a rusted ladder. The supervisor called me a coward, got up about 7 rungs before his foot went through one, and I heard his foot snap as he fell. I called an ambulance and walked to my car in the parking lot. Story 5. Wasn't exactly the first day, but I didn't show up after the second shift. It was a rather popular cafe chain in my country. I was hired to work in the kitchen as a cook along with another senior cook. Let's put aside the fact that I had zero cooking knowledge whatsoever. The senior cook was leaving the kitchen every 5 minutes to smoke. So there I am, alone in the kitchen, orders are printing fast, and I'm standing there not sure what to do first. And the waitress comes over yelling at me to cook things I don't have any business cooking. Definitely not on my own. Later on, the senior cook told me they had at least 2 rats running around the kitchen. Showed me they had pooped on a plate. I never came back, and I'm glad the place got shut down. Story 6. On the first day of working at Amazon warehouse, the managers explained to everyone how a 15-minute break works there. Walking to the break room is 2.5 minutes, 10 minutes of actual break, and then 2.5 minutes to go back to your stations. Took me 2.5 minutes to walk to my car, and I took a forever break. Story 7. Summer job working for a landscape architect. Got to the job site and he asked me to dig a hole in some rocky dirt. I asked for a shovel. He didn't have one. I asked for a hand spade. He didn't have one. He told me to just dig the hole with my bare hands, and then he drove off to another site, leaving me completely alone. I dug for a little bit and then said this and left. Had the job specified that I needed to supply my own tools, I could have, but it didn't, and I wasn't going to work for somebody that expected people to dig through hard, rocky soil with their hands. Story 8. When I burned my hands all night on the 2 hot plates as a food runner, they wouldn't let me use towels to carry them and said I just had to get used to it. Nope. Story 9. I answered an ad in the paper, this was the mid-1990s, for what seemed to be an office job making sales calls while I was in college. I did a phone interview and was called back for an in-person interview. When I went to the interview, I was led into a room with about 50 other people and a small stage at the front. We were all somewhat confused about what was going on. Finally, a guy got on the stage and informed us that we had been selected for the opportunity to sell Cutco. 2/3 of us stood up and walked out. Story 10. I opted out of an interview one time, thanked them at the end and said it wasn't for me. Those interviewing management-level folks started arguing with each other in front of me during the interview. I figured if this is the vibe at the management level, then I sure as hell don't want to be your employee. Story 11. I was a cashier at Lowe's during college for less than a full day. I made it through the multiple-day training, but there was so much going on that I almost thought I was on a hidden camera show. All of the employees complained about how hard they had to work while simultaneously not getting enough hours. Nobody understood why they were hiring for new people, including me. It turns out it was because they were dealing with a sexual harassment complaint that required restructuring of the store and firing some employees. This was known to human resources and explained to new hires against company policy, but wasn't known to the employees. Apparently, some of them still worked there, including the person doing the training. She was inappropriate and said not to worry about the sexual harassment issues, that everything would go back to normal soon enough, and we wouldn't have to be so uptight. They fired her the day before I started, along with one of the cashiers who trained me. She also offered me terrible guidance for the application process. They were looking for part-time help, and 2 of the 3 days they needed help on, I had off from school. I told them I could work nights most nights, but if they needed daytime help, it had to be on those days. She said if I was too restrictive, they wouldn't keep me on, lied to my boss about my availability to make me even more attractive than I already was, and told me to schmooze them a bit and I'd get further. She said in the end it wouldn't impact anything and I'd get those days. My first week schedule had me working mornings every day that I was in school, and I wasn't given any hours on my days off. Aside from the fact that I was given twice the hours the position called for, when other employees were shorted, my work schedule was literally impossible to consolidate with my school schedule. I only went to work on my first day to tell them I was quitting and that their application process was a mess. They couldn't figure out how so much went wrong, and then they asked who trained me, and everything made sense. They thanked me for at least showing up to quit, unlike the other 3 they hired who just stopped returning their calls and no-showed their first days. Story 12. A long time ago, not long after getting my papers as a chef, I had an interview at a hotel for a position in the kitchen. The executive chef and I chatted in his office for about 20 minutes. At the time, I remember him coming off as very arrogant, which is quite common in this field. I didn't think much of it at the time, as the pay was decent and the shift was what I wanted. As I was leaving his office, I turned to leave through the dining room the way I had come in, which was closed at the time. It was another hour or so before service started. He said to me, "No, not that way. Go through the kitchen. You're not good enough to go through the dining room." I was so surprised by what he said. I just did what he asked without a word. Later on, after I had gotten home, I phoned him up and said that after having a close look, I decided that his menu wasn't good enough and that I wouldn't be accepting his offer. Story 13. Restaurant. I swept under my station when we were closing. A giant brown pile came out with the broom from under the lowboy fridge. The pile began to scatter. It was hundreds of roaches. I never returned. Story 14. My first ever job. I was 13, and I would be delivering phone books from the back of a van through people's letterboxes. So I'd be in the back of the van with the phone books, and there was an older guy driving slowly while I went back and forth to the van and houses with the books. At one point, the van was getting quite empty, so there was more space to move around. We had finished the delivery in the street we were paid to deliver to, and he drove to another. While driving there, he drove, let's say, aggressively, and I fell inside the back where the books were. I wasn't sitting in a seat, as the van had no seats in the back. As I put my hand out to steady myself, I accidentally laid it across a portable radio that had its antenna extended. But the antenna was also broken halfway and razor sharp. It sliced the palm of my hand clean open, 3 to 4 inches. I can only describe what I saw as gruesome. I told him to pull the van over and said I needed help. He saw my hand and just threw me a plastic bag, the kind you'd get at a supermarket, and told me to wrap my hand in it. Then he continued with the deliveries. At least he delivered the remaining books himself. I should have been taken to a hospital or at least home to my parents. I quit after that and never showed up again. As you can imagine, my parents were quite angry at him. Story 15. I got hired at a very small knockoff dollar store in an old, failing mall. The owner was foreign with a very thick accent. He told me I would get $6 an hour but neglected to mention it was under the table. I spent about an hour stocking the very overly cluttered shelves before I was told to get more chips out of the back storage area. I walked back there, and there were about a dozen men sitting on boxes all crammed into a small back room. I asked where the chips were, and these guys all glared at me. They started speaking in another language and rapidly motioned towards me. Then one guy got up and asked what I needed. I told him I was supposed to get a box of chips, and he got a box out of the pile and handed it to me. The entire time these guys were all staring at me. Everything back there looked shady as all hell, and it was very uncomfortable. A while later, I had to use the restroom, which was also in the back. These guys all just wordlessly glared at me while I went into the women's restroom. While I was in the restroom, someone tried to open the door. I was the only woman there. The owner told me he wanted me to come back that night late in the evening. Well, after the mall closed. I did not show up. I came in the next morning and lied about why I could not work there. He still gave me the few bucks from what little time I did work. I do not know what in the hell that guy had going on there, and I did not want to find out. Edit. Forgot to add in the best part. I was 18, and this was supposed to have been my first job. Story 16. Restaurant line chef. Worked a 12-hour shift. Was given 2 breaks of about 10 to 15 minutes each. Burned my hand numerous times because they gave me plates that came right from the oven and never said a word. At the end of the shift, I told the head chef I was done. He called me soft and said I was the 3rd person to quit on him after a day. I said maybe it's the way you treat people. Story 17. Once I applied for and got a telemarketing job. I didn't know what it entailed. After an hour, I knew it was a terrible fit, auto-dialing people during their dinners, trying to sell them stuff they didn't want. Reading a horrible script while sitting in a soulless gray cubicle. I got up, went to the manager, apologized, and said it wasn't a good fit for me. He seemed understanding. Another time I attended a Make Easy Money at this job seminar, and it turns out it was selling knives door to door. I don't know if I technically quit or just left at the end of it. Story 18. I answered an advertisement for a babysitting job. I was already working on a casual basis, but it was sporadic, so I thought some after-hours babysitting would be welcome extra cash. The couple were both in the military and proceeded to tell me that I would be staying in the spare room and looking after their 6-month-old child around the clock, as well as doing the housework. I would have 1 day off every 2 weeks. They said it is cash in hand, so I could sign on to unemployment benefits to make up the rest of the money. I left on the spot. They wanted a live-in housemaid and nanny, not a babysitter, and they were not able to pay for one. Why they thought it was up to me to illegally collect unemployment benefits to subsidize them, I don't know.